To the next session. Thank you very much, Engineer Basma. And سوف أعرض هذه.
Did an amazing job and showed also the importance of this condition in the Arab region. So I'm going to be speaking really about what we are trying to do about this in the Arab region. And I believe this is an example of an opportunity to apply the Codex guidance into both regional or national applications. The next slide, please. So I'm not going to repeat entirely what was said. The issue of celiac disease, this is an immune-mediated reaction. It's not an allergy. Allergy is mediated with immunoglobulin E. This one is mediated generally by immunoglobulin G or A's. The difference is that it does not lead essentially to anaphylaxis, but the immune system is involved in recognizing the culprit ingredient and then starts another type of reaction. And the culprit ingredient in this case is a protein known as gluten protein, which is present primarily in wheat, but also in associated grains. So it's not only wheat, it's wheat, barley, rye. So essentially حتى الشعير يؤدي إلى نفس الcondition ليس فقط القمح. Exposure to gluten will lead to an immune-mediated adverse reaction. And the most important impact is that you have a deterioration of the lining of the small intestine. And you know that the intestine is the place where nutrients are absorbed. So if the intestine is deteriorated, you have all sorts of conditions that result from malabsorption of nutrients. And Mrs. Abida mentioned, you can have osteoporosis, you can have increased risk of reproductive problems, and it goes all the way to cancer when the exposure is chronic and maintained over time without stopping exposure to gluten. Now, this is a lifelong condition, which means that there is no cure. Unfortunately, there is no cure to this situation. Research continues, but no cure. The prevalence at the international level is 1%. But it seems that in the Arab region, the prevalence is higher than that, even though it's not fully quantified. And the diagnosis tends to be quite late, in the sense that the average diagnosis in North America, for example, is 46 years old. So you can be living with this condition for some time and do not suspect that you have it until you may end up being diagnosed. Given that it cannot be cured, the only thing that remains for individuals with this condition is to manage it. And the only way to manage it is to take away gluten entirely from the diet. So avoidance is the only way to be able to manage the symptoms, meaning to make sure that the symptoms do not happen. The next slide, please. So what is the intervention then? Both from a public health standpoint and from the regulatory standpoint, it is a lifelong avoidance of gluten, taking away gluten from the diet on a lifelong basis. And basically, what does this mean? You need to take away wheat, rye, barley, triticale, which is a hybrid of wheat and barley. But oats, you need to take them away, not because oats have the protein that induce the reaction, but because oats are cross-contaminated for the most part with wheat and barley. And generally, the issue is not that you have a reaction to the pure ingredient, but anything where wheat can occur as a result of cross-contamination, you can have a situation of exposure that can lead to the reactions. So for example, we know that soy is produced, transported, and so on in the same type of processes as grains. And as a result, you may have wheat and soy as a result of that. So any potential cross-contamination may lead to the exposure. Gluten, you see, can be present as a result of the addition of these ingredients, but also any type of issues related to manufacture where wheat can be introduced. For example, spices may contain gluten in them, simply as part of the manufacturing process. Now, I've heard a question about sodium glutamate. Sodium glutamate is not a source of gluten. And I would like to say that this is probably an issue of risk communication that is out there. And if additives are associated with the reaction to gluten, it may be only due, based on the current scientific knowledge, to cross-contamination in the manufacturing. So essentially, these are also, I would say, false information that is being shared as a result of particularly risk communication issues associated with sodium glutamate. We know that there's a lot of misinformation about sodium glutamate, and sodium glutamate does not contain basically gluten because it's not a protein. So basically, for celiac individuals, to be able to manage their condition, they need to rely on food that they know would be gluten-free. How can they do that? They can do that either by seeing a food and where there is a label that says it's gluten-free. That's potentially an assurance for them to have a gluten-free product. The other option is that they have to replace the source of gluten by another ingredient. So for example, you would replace wheat by buckwheat. Buckwheat is not supposed to contain gluten. You replace wheat by rice. You replace it by corn. You replace it by legumes like chickpeas, for example. So you could use some legumes as a result of that. The only issue, though, is that you need to make sure that the source that you use to replace does not contain a cross-contamination with a source of gluten. And this is actually an issue that celiac individuals are faced with. The next slide, please. So what is the expectation from manufacturers that would provide alternatives for celiac individuals is that gluten is removed from the food that is meant to be destined for celiac individuals. And in fact, there is a threshold level. So celiac manifestation is based on a threshold reaction. So you do not react to any level. You have a threshold. And the threshold is based on a pivotal study essentially made by this group of researchers led by Professor Katasi. 10 milligrams of exposure to gluten on a daily basis was found not to induce I would say, a public health concern. So essentially, as long as you maintain your exposure to 10 milligrams or lower, you should be okay. And this is the basis upon which regulatory measures were developed. So if we see now how this was regulated subsequently, so the next slide, please. Basically, you need to have a collaboration between stakeholders to make sure that celiac individuals have access to alternative sources of food. And regulators are there to enable such availability. Now, Codex, the next slide, please. Codex has come up with guidance on this, and this is in fact one of the key Codex standards that was developed, in fact, in the 1980s. It's an old standard, in fact. It was developed way about over 2 decades ago, close to, well, 3 decades ago now. This particular standard has been amended several times to reflect the scientific knowledge. And mostly, the amendments have accounted for the permitted threshold for gluten. It used to be 200 ppm, it got dropped to 100 ppm, and now it got dropped to 20 ppm. The 20 ppm is based on that 10 milligram threshold. So if we go to the next slide, please. Sorry. Now, there's another standard in Codex that also guides both industry and regulators. So it's good to have a direction, which is your 20 ppm, but you have also another standard that is about the method. And in fact, there is a standard CXS 234, 1999 has a provision in relation with a gluten-free standard. So this is essentially the way the standard reads after the amendment of 2015. The amendment of 2015 identified 20 ppm as the cutoff. It says that gluten-free foods are dietary foods consisted or made only from one or more ingredients which do not contain the grains, and then it gives a maximum. So these grains and their proteins should not be present at a level higher than 20 parts per million. It's also indicating that you can call gluten-free food those food where you removed the protein, again, with reaching the cutoff of 20 parts per million. So this also indicates that technically you should not be calling gluten-free a product that is not intended to be containing gluten or to be used as a replacement for gluten sources. So for example, water, you should not be having a gluten-free statement on water because water is always gluten-free. Orange juice should not be called gluten-free because orange juice is always gluten-free. So essentially, this is really to identify those foods that are either alternative to gluten-containing products or where gluten proteins have been removed. The second standard in Codex is the method standard. And here, Codex has identified a type 1 method. So essentially, this is a method that is directed to the identification with precision of the marker of gluten. And in this case, it's an ELISA-based method that is utilizing an antibody that is known as the R5 antibody. The R5 antibody, basically, this is an antibody that has been generated against a common pentapeptide that is present in proteins that are common to wheat, barley, rye, triticale. In fact, this pentapeptide doesn't exist in oats. And that's why the majority of celiac individuals would be able to use oats if oats are pure. So oats can be gluten-free if they are pure. Now, the gluten analysis, following the Codex standard, you use the R5 ELISA, but of course, you need to make sure that your method is fit for the food where you are trying to use the method. And that's sometimes more complex than we think. Now, if we want to apply this in the Arab region, so I think actually the Jordanian experience is a great one that we can look at. Basically, what Jordan did, what Egypt probably did, and other countries who have attempted to do this is essentially to use Codex as a benchmark. But when we use Codex as a benchmark, we need also to make sure that the Codex guidance will be able to protect the population. But it's a great start. You did already adopt a standard on the basis, or you are on the way to adopt a standard that is based on Codex. But what we need to check is whether or not the 20 parts per million that was adopted by Codex is protective for the population that you have, particularly that your dietary sources might be providing you with different sources of gluten without knowing, particularly if you are having different alternatives for gluten that are included in the diet of celiac individuals. So you have a couple of questions that you need to answer in order to do that, or at least in order to do this on an evidence-based approach. The first question is, what is the level of exposure to gluten following a gluten-free diet in Arab countries? And this, I don't believe that we have seen a study that has attempted to reply to this. And the question is the 20 parts per million cutoff protective enough for the population in Arab countries? And are there enough alternatives of gluten free foods, meaning foods that replace gluten-containing ingredients. So basically, in doing so, we are aiming to promote safe alternatives for individuals with celiac disease. Now, in order to do that, and in fact, these initiatives have been identified previously, but they have been furthered as a result of holding last month here, practically in the same room in Jordan, a meeting of the Arab section of AOAC International, where in fact Mrs. Abida has presented the issue and identified a number of questions that we would like to collaborate with you on attempting to answer. The first question is, do we have methods that are standardized in the Arab region and that we can rely upon with confidence as methods that would allow us to measure gluten in gluten-free foods, including foods that are available in this region? And for this, we're not going to be reinventing the wheel. The idea is to use the AOAC-based approach. I think you all know about AOAC, which is essentially one of the major sources of standardized methods that Codex relies upon. And the idea is to look at a way to evaluate the performance of these methods in order to adopt official methods for gluten testing that could be adopted by standardization organizations, including at the national level or at the regional level. The second question, in order to do the exposure assessment, and I believe Dr. Maha explained that earlier in her presentation, Dr. Maha indicated that there are data, at least in Lebanon, on the way celiac individuals consume alternative food to those that contain gluten. So the idea is actually to have a consumption information that characterizes what is the diet of a celiac individual when they remove the wheat or the barley containing ingredients. What do they replace it with? And when they replace it with that, how much gluten proteins do we find in there? So we need to have also a survey, and that's the third point, a survey of gluten occurrence in the so-called gluten-free foods, both the foods that are labeled as gluten-free, but also the foods that are used as alternative sources to gluten-containing foods. So the last slide, basically by doing that, we hope that we will gather the information needed that would allow us then to conduct an exposure assessment. The exposure assessment will allow us to say, are we above or below the 10 milligram that we identified in that Katasi study? If we are below the 10 milligram, maintaining the cutoff of 20 parts per million, we can consider that the 20 parts per million is suitable for celiac individuals in the country or in the region. If, however, doing simulations of exposure assessment and we find that we are above the 10 milligram, then we will consider that that cutoff might need to be adjusted in order to be more protective for the celiac individuals. So I hope I shared with you the approach. This is really an application of how we can apply a Codex standard and adapting it to the purposes of a region or a country. And again, thank you for your contribution and your attention.